This first hour is brought to you by our sponsor, Critical Cosmetics, my good friend Ravi. I'm actually snowed under now with these samples. These are face and hair products, literally good enough to eat, and I have eaten them. And this one in particular, maple pistachio, is to die for. Thank you, Ravi, for your ongoing sponsorship of the first hour of the mother of all talk shows. Some big news coming from Critical Cosmetics later in the hour about their 16 new flavors and their 10-pack samples coming soon. Millions of people watched all or part of the mother of all talk shows over the last 10 days. I mean millions of people. I can only be specific about the 2.59 millions who watched all or part of the mother of all talk shows on the mainstream platforms that can be checked right now by any one of you. 2.59 million in 10 days. But I cannot count the viral quality of the pirate clip, which has now been repirated and repirated, in Arabic in particular, all over the world. But I can hazard a guess that at least another 2.59 million have seen that clip. I mention it not just because I'm proud of it. Why wouldn't I be? Why wouldn't my team be? But to show to you that you are a part of a family now growing vast, dwarfing all other comparable television ventures anywhere in the world. If I tell you that BBC Question Time tomorrow night will get an audience of around 220,000, you can put into perspective the kind of numbers that we are now racking up with no advertising budget, with no cross-media fertilization. Not a single person or organ of the mainstream media ever mentions the existence of the mother of all talk shows. This is all down to you. It's you who have kept this audience growing, and it's your word of mouth that is ensuring it is into the stratosphere now. And Ravi, our sponsor for the first hour, will need to be joined by a new sponsor for our second hour. I'll talk about that very shortly. Now, I was very privileged to be there in Havana, in Cuba, when Fidel Castro, 30 years ago or more, denounced the so-called NGOs, non-government organizations they call themselves. Back then, there were some non-government organizations. I myself was the head of one of them for 3 years in the 1980s. But increasingly, those NGOs really should drop the N because they are government organizations. Fidel called them Trojan horses and banned them from Cuba, and called upon all like-minded leaders throughout the developing world to kick these Trojan horses out of their gates. And it was a perfect crystallization of what I, even in the 1980s, had begun to see. These NGOs, whilst no doubt their volunteers and some at least of their staff are not doing it for the increasingly large salaries, but out of the goodness of their hearts, a kind of vocation, the people that volunteer in charity shops and so on, I make no criticism at all of them. But these organizations increasingly are a tool for the Western governments, which increasingly supply most of their money. The bigger the charity, the bigger the NGO, the more likely their state, or in the case of the EU, an agglomeration of states, are funding their operations. And of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That lunch comes with strings. And those strings are that these NGOs increasingly have to follow the diktat. And some of them do it very willingly indeed. of the so-called human rights narrative of the so-called rules-based order, which is effectively American rules and the basis of international relations over the unipolar period, which is now rapidly coming to an end. The United States and its loyal satrapies decide what the rules are with no legal basis whatsoever, never mind a decision of the world's governing body, the United Nations and its Security Council, and they ruthlessly impose them on countries. They send in the economic hitmen to do the job and hope that by strapping a yoke of indebtedness onto developing countries, they can keep them in line, secure their votes in the United Nations, get their level of debt through international institutions that they control, like the World Bank and the IMF. But if the economic hitmen don't work, then the jackals come next. The jackals kill people. That's their job. If the economic hitman doesn't get you, the jackal will get you. And if the jackal can't get you, as in the case of Fidel Castro, for example, then the military is more than ready to move in. In some cases, all three are present at the same time. Mali is a case in point. In the French colony of Mali, the economic hitmen were in for a very long time. The jackals have been ever present. The day of the jackal in Mali has been every day since independence. And even the French military, the so-called Foreign Legion, have been repeatedly interposed into internal affairs in Mali. And murder and mayhem has been the result. But Mali now has a president that is standing up to French colonialism. And he has booted out the Trojan horses of the French so-called NGOs. We'll be talking to an Africa expert on this very subject in just a few minutes' time. I mentioned Trudeau earlier, hypocrite of the 21st century. I myself think that he wins that prize out the park for a whole range of things. You've seen him in blackface, though he is achingly concerned about anything that might possibly be described as racism. And you see him now denouncing China for its attitude to lockdown protests when he led his own stormtroopers, who included a cabinet discussion about sending in the Canadian military to destroy the truckers' protest against COVID-19 protests in his own country of Canada. He didn't, in the end, send the army, but he sent the Royal Canadian Mounted Police by the score, by the hundreds. He froze the bank accounts of those truckers, blue-collar workers, who were merely protesting the restrictions on their ability to work for a living and feed their families, on what they regarded, whether they were right or wrong, as a bogus scientific and medical prospectus. He literally stole their money. He froze their bank accounts. He hunted down, in association with the US government of Joe Biden, the personal bank accounts of American donors to those trucker protesters. He denounced as Trumpian, even fascist, anyone who stood up to the zero COVID pretensions of the great pretender, Justin Trudeau. But when the Chinese came onto the streets in comparatively small numbers, China is a country of 1.5 billion people after all, out came Trudeau onto the steps with the microphone, denouncing China and hailing the anti-lockdown protesters in China as freedom fighters. But Trudeau was not alone. the British media, for example, which literally ignored completely the existence of huge protests throughout the United Kingdom, but particularly in London, throughout the COVID-19 emergency, even when those protests were literally under their window. In the case of the BBC, thousands of people rallied outside the BBC, protesting at the perceived one-sidedness of their narrative on the coronavirus crisis, and they didn't even put a camera out of their own window to film it. And if they did, they certainly never broadcast it. It never happened, you see, for the great majority of the British people. And the same was true of all the television companies. Same was true of all the fancy newspapers in Britain and in the United States of America. Countries like Sweden that took a different line on COVID-19 were regularly denounced as outliers, as outlaws, as renegades, even though now that we look back on it, their record of excess deaths was less than ours, and they had none of the economic carnage and other carnage that our policies of COVID created. In the United States, 1.3 million people are said to have died from the coronavirus 19 pandemic. In China, it's 5,000. 5,000 in a country of 1.5 billion. In the United States, almost 1.3 million. You do the maths and see whose approach, whose attitude to coronavirus pandemic measures and lockdowns worked and whose didn't. Now, of course, Chinese people must be desperately tired of the terrific level of restrictions imposed by the Chinese state to keep that 5,000 number down close to where it is. Who wouldn't be? I now look back on the 2 years of my life that we all partially lost as a result of COVID-19 with something akin to disbelief. Disbelief, in my case, believing all of the propaganda that the medical profession and the big pharma gave me. Disbelief that our society, our children, our health service, our economy lost so much out of a virus whose, if you like, origin we remain utterly oblivious of. We still don't know if it was man-made. If it was man-made, who made it? And if it was man-made, for what purpose? Did it come from a pangolin or a bat? We don't know any of these things, and yet millions of people have died, and trillions of dollars of economic wreckage lie behind us and are now used to justify the economic freeze that we are now beginning to be in the middle of. Who knows whose approach was right? I don't. Everyone has a different point of view on that. But China's attitude to COVID-19 is China's business, not Trudeau's, not Joe Biden's, not the Guardian's or the New York Times. It is the business of China. And time will tell how effective this latest crackdown on COVID-19 in China turns out to be. And at what cost? Because there's no point in pretending that measures that are taken and that may or may not be successful don't have commensurate damage or impact somewhere else in the economy and in the society. Ursula von der Leyen, the Gauleiter of the European Union Commission, made the mistake of speaking the truth to camera about the death toll of Ukrainian forces in the Russian-NATO-Ukraine war. They cut it out. It was such a big mistake once it had been broadcast once. But luckily, some clever people captured the first broadcast. And in it, von der Leyen says that more than 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since February 25 of this year. That is to say, in less than a year. On the basis that in every war, between 2.5 and 3 times the number of people are wounded as are killed, that means close to 500,000 casualties in Ukraine in just 10 months. This means the cost of the war that Joe Biden and NATO are insisting must continue has reached stratospheric levels, catastrophic levels. The damage to Ukrainian society will not be recovered from for generations to come. In Kiev now there is no lights and no water and no heating. Although there's always lights for Zelensky's television appearances and his Vogue and Vanity Fair photo shoots. But for the great mass of the suffering people of the great city of Kiev, which I've visited many times and adored and loved with all my heart, are suffering that you cannot go to the toilet above the second floor of the high-rise buildings in which many, maybe most, of the people of Kiev now live, because you need electricity to work the pumps, to work the toilet. Just think about that, if you will. It's very cold here in the United Kingdom on this, the 30th of November, but not nearly as cold as it is in Ukraine. And not nearly as cold in Ukraine on the 30th of November as it will be on the 30th of December, the 30th of January, and the 30th of the 28th of February. It is a nightmare that the people of Ukraine are now living through, and all because of the US and EU organized coup to overthrow the elected government in Ukraine in 2014, and the mass murder of thousands of their own people carried out by the regime that came to power by violent coup, setting their parliament on fire and their president to flee. Those 8 years since 2014 have reached a death toll which is now reaching catastrophic levels. If van der Leyen is accurate, then the number of dead soldiers and the number of inexorably wounded and maimed soldiers is a scar on the face of Ukraine that will never heal. And of course, all attempts to reach a negotiated settlement, whether brokered by President Erdogan in Turkey or others, have fallen on stony ground because of the absolute insistence of Western leaders that the government in Kiev not conclude a peace with Russia that will satisfy Russia's legitimate security concerns. And so the war goes on, and with General Winter now on the battlefield, the future is bleak indeed. East of the Dnipro, very soon all Ukrainian military units will be destroyed or will have surrendered. And then the focus moves to the south, to Ukraine's coast, to places like Odessa and other great Russian civilizations that have been in the hands of a country which had been handed over to NATO, to the United States of America, and to the Biden crime family itself for the production of deadly pathogens in US-owned and controlled biolabs seeded throughout the territory of the Ukraine, but mainly in the east of the country, as close as possible to the Russian frontier. I've spoken too long, but it's important what I've had to say. Fasten your seatbelts. It really is the mother of all talk shows.